Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about congruent triangles, and specifically we're going to be talking about congruency statements, how to read and write those, and we're also going to be looking at identifying congruent parts and using that information to solve for some missing measures. Now you might be unsure what congruent means. Congruent, when we're talking about shapes, polygons, other shapes, that congruent means that they are the same size and shape, basically that they're copies of each other. And so when two triangles in this instance are congruent, we know that all the corresponding parts are going to be congruent as well. So when we look at the sides, all the corresponding sides are going to be congruent, and all the corresponding angles in the two triangles are going to be congruent. Now, corresponding means that they're in the same position. Okay, so imagine we have a couple of triangles like these two, ABC and DEF, and we'll talk about how to name those here in just a minute. But corresponding means that they're in the same position of their relative triangle. So for instance, if we look at the angles, angle A is in the same position as angle D, even though it doesn't look like it. These diagrams are drawn, and you'll see this a lot, where the shapes aren't necessarily oriented in the same direction. Okay, so we're going to have to be able to determine which sides and which angles correspond to each other, which ones are in the same position of those triangles. Now in this case, we're given some markers here that tell us which sides are congruent to which sides in the second triangle. So we can look at all the sides in that triangle ABC, look at the tick marks for instance, and see which sides are congruent in the second triangle. Sides with one mark are congruent to the sides with one mark in the second triangle, and so on. So if we look at A to C, the two on the bottom, right? A to C, since it has the three markings, that means that D to F in the other triangle is essentially in the same position, and it corresponds to the first side, so those two sides are going to be congruent. When we look at B to C and E to F, we see that those two have the same markings, then those two sides have to be congruent. And then when we look at the third sides, those two have to be congruent from A to B and D to E. Looking at the angles, we're using a different marker here. We're using those arc symbols, and the corresponding angles from one triangle to the other that match or that are congruent are going to have the same number of arcs in there. So if we look at A and D, for instance, those two angles are labeled with one arc measure or arc symbol. So that means that those are the same measure. So angle A and angle D correspond to each other and are congruent. When we look at the others, B and E have the same markings, so those are going to be congruent to each other, and C and F will be congruent to each other as well because those have two marks, two arc symbols there. So we know that all of the parts are the same, or all the parts are congruent, and the corresponding parts are congruent. So we can write a congruency statement that states the triangle ABC is congruent to DEF. And really all of these are congruency statements. When we're writing that parts are congruent to each other or that triangles are congruent to each other, these are congruency statements. And we're going to talk a little bit how to write those, but also how to use that information to solve for some other things.